In the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces advanced across the Pacific theater, the United States military faced an unprecedented logistical challenge. Thousands of Japanese servicemen captured in operations from Saipan to the Philippines required secure detention facilities on American soil. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, established as an Army training center in 1909, became one of several mainland installations designated to house enemy prisoners of war under protocols established by the 1929 Geneva Convention. On a gray October morning in 1944, a military transport train arrived at the Fort McCoy rail depot carrying approximately 300 Japanese prisoners. These men, captured during operations in the Marshall Islands and the Marianas Campaign, represented the first significant group of Japanese POWs processed through the Wisconsin facility. Military records indicate that each prisoner had been tagged with identification cards containing name, rank, and serial number, standard procedure for all enemy combatants entering American custody. The men who disembarked that day had experienced capture under conditions vastly different from their training. Imperial Japanese military doctrine emphasized fighting to the death rather than surrender, teaching soldiers that capture meant dishonor worse than death itself. American intelligence reports from the period noted that Japanese forces often preferred suicide attacks or civilian disguises over formal surrender, making prisoner acquisition a complex military and psychological operation. Fort McCoy's physical layout reflected its dual purpose as both training facility and detention center. The installation covered approximately 60,000 acres of central Wisconsin terrain, characterized by flat agricultural land interspersed with pine forests. The POW compound occupied a segregated section surrounded by 12-foot barbed wire, fencing and elevated guard towers positioned at regular intervals. Military police units from the Army's Provost Marshal General's office provided perimeter security, with standing orders to prevent escape while maintaining conditions consistent with international law. The processing procedure followed protocols established by the War Department's Prisoner of War Division. Upon arrival, each Japanese captive underwent medical examination to identify injuries, infectious diseases, or malnutrition requiring immediate treatment. Army physicians documented that many prisoners showed signs of prolonged dietary deficiency, a condition endemic throughout Japanese forces in the Pacific by late 1944, as American submarine warfare severed supply lines to isolated garrisons. Following medical screening, prisoners received standard issue clothing, denim work jackets and trousers marked with the letters PW stenciled in black paint across the back. This identification served both practical and legal purposes, distinguishing prisoners from civilian populations while complying with Geneva Convention requirements for humane treatment. Each man also received basic hygiene supplies including soap, razors, and toothbrushes, items that records indicate were in critically short supply throughout the Japanese military by this stage of the war. If you appreciate evidence-based World War II history presented without dramatization, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment indicating where you're watching from. Your engagement helps preserve these important historical accounts. The barracks assigned to Japanese prisoners consisted of standard military construction, wooden frame buildings measuring approximately 20 by 100 feet, heated by coal-burning stoves and equipped with rows of metal cots. Each structure housed between 40 and 50 men, with wool blankets provided according to Army quartermaster specifications. Declassified inspection reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General indicate that Fort McCoy maintained barracks conditions equivalent to those provided for American troops in training, a deliberate policy designed to demonstrate American adherence to international humanitarian standards. Contemporary documentation reveals that many Japanese prisoners initially interpreted their treatment with profound suspicion. Propaganda distributed by imperial military authorities throughout the war had characterized Americans as barbarous enemies who tortured and executed captives. The reality confronting these men at Fort McCoy: orderly registration procedures, medical care, and adequate shelter contradicted everything their training had prepared them to expect. The psychological impact of this cognitive dissonance appears repeatedly in post-war interviews and memoirs. Former prisoners documented their initial disbelief that an enemy nation would expend resources on captive welfare. Some accounts describe prisoners examining barracks for hidden torture chambers or testing food for poison behaviors, reflecting deep-seated mistrust instilled by years of military indoctrination. American military policy regarding POW treatment derived from multiple sources. The 1929 Geneva Convention established baseline standards for prisoner welfare, including adequate food, shelter, and medical care. The United States, having ratified this treaty, committed to upholding these standards regardless of whether enemy nations reciprocated. Additionally, American military leadership understood that humane POW treatment served strategic purposes. It encouraged enemy surrender, provided intelligence opportunities through cooperative prisoners, and demonstrated American values to neutral nations and post-war populations. Fort McCoy's first night housing Japanese prisoners passed without significant incident. Guard rotations maintained vigilance, though records indicate no escape attempts occurred during the initial weeks of detention. The prisoners, exhausted from transport and processing, adapted to their new environment with the discipline characteristic of Japanese military training, maintaining cleanliness, observing rank hierarchies among themselves, and responding promptly to guard instructions relayed through interpreters. The contrast between American detention practices and Japanese military culture would become increasingly apparent in subsequent weeks. For men trained in an army where officers routinely struck subordinates and where rations consisted of rice and pickled vegetables, the systematic order of Fort McCoy represented a confrontation with an entirely different military philosophy, one that would challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare and the treatment of defeated enemies. The feeding of enemy prisoners represented one of the most scrutinized aspects of American POW administration during World War II. Article 11 of the 1929 Geneva Convention specified that prisoners must receive daily rations equal in quantity and quality to those of depot troops of the detaining power. The United States War Department interpreted this mandate strictly, directing that POW meals match those provided to American soldiers stationed at domestic military installations. At Fort McCoy, the Army Quartermaster Corps implemented this policy through standardized meal planning. Declassified records from the installation mess operations indicate that Japanese prisoners received 3 meals daily according to a rotating menu that included meat, bread, vegetables, dairy products, and coffee items that collectively exceeded both the caloric content and nutritional variety of standard Japanese military rations by significant margins. The breakfast served to prisoners on their first full day at Fort McCoy exemplified this disparity. According to quartermaster documentation, the morning meal consisted of scrambled eggs prepared from powdered egg concentrate, sliced ham, white bread toast with butter, and coffee. The portion sizes followed Army specifications: approximately 6 ounces of protein, 4 slices of bread, and unlimited coffee refills. For comparison, Japanese Army field rations in the Pacific Theater during 1944 typically consisted of rice balls, dried fish, and pickled vegetables, with total daily caloric intake often falling below 2,000 calories due to supply disruptions. When Japanese prisoners first encountered American military food service, their reactions reflected deep cultural and experiential gaps. Multiple post-war accounts describe prisoners examining their meal trays with confusion, uncertain whether the food was intended for individual consumption or communal sharing. One frequently cited anecdote involves a prisoner asking through an interpreter if the group should divide a single breakfast tray among several men, a question that American mess personnel found incomprehensible but which accurately reflect e.g. Japanese military experience, where food scarcity was normalized. The quantity of food served generated particular disbelief. American military standards provided approximately 3,500 calories daily to soldiers performing moderate physical labor. Japanese prisoners, many of whom had survived on severely restricted rations in the Pacific, encountered portion sizes they associated with ceremonial feasts rather than routine meals. Historical records indicate that some prisoners initially refused complete servings, fearing punishment for what they perceived as excessive consumption. American cooks and mess sergeants responded to prisoner confusion with practical indifference. Their orders specified equal treatment, and they executed those orders without particular concern for prisoner psychology. One mess sergeant's report noted, "The Japs don't eat much. They stare at the food like they've never seen ham before. We just tell them it's theirs and move them through the line." The coffee presented particular challenges. Japanese military culture had no equivalent beverage tradition, and the bitter taste of American military coffee, typically prepared strong and served black, proved unpalatable to many prisoners initially. Records indicate that some prisoners traded their coffee for extra rice portions when rice became available, while others gradually acquired a taste for the beverage over subsequent weeks. The implementation of Geneva Convention feeding standards at Fort McCoy occurred within a broader American military logistics system of remarkable scale. By 1944, the United States had developed the most efficient military supply chain in history, capable of feeding millions of soldiers across multiple theaters simultaneously. This logistical capacity extended to POW populations, with the quartermaster corps maintaining separate accounting for prisoner rations to ensure compliance with international law. Documentation from the Office of the Provost Marshal General reveals systematic oversight of POW feeding programs. Regular inspections verified that prisoners received mandated rations, that food quality met specifications, and that any deviations from standards were documented and corrected. These inspections served dual purposes: ensuring American compliance with international law and defending against potential post-war accusations of prisoner mistreatment. The ideological implications of food provision were not lost on American military administrators. Classified intelligence assessments noted that well-fed prisoners demonstrated increased cooperation with interrogators and reduced resistance to work details. More broadly, administrators recognized that visible adherence to Geneva Convention standards undermined Japanese propaganda about American barbarism. If Japanese soldiers could observe humane treatment with their own eyes and eventually communicate this reality to others, it might encourage future surrenders, a strategic consideration, given the difficulty of capturing Japanese troops who had been indoctrinated to prefer death over dishonor. The prisoners themselves struggled to reconcile American food provision with their previous understanding of warfare. Japanese military culture emphasized stoicism and deprivation as virtues. Officers were expected to eat after enlisted men, and complaints about food were considered disgraceful. The abundance at Fort McCoy violated these cultural norms, creating what modern psychologists might describe as cognitive dissonance, a mental conflict between internalized beliefs and observable reality. Some prisoners developed interpretive frameworks to explain their treatment. One theory circulating through the barracks held that Americans fed prisoners well because American culture valued material wealth over spiritual strength. Another interpretation suggested that generous rations were temporary, designed to lower guard before harsher treatment began. A smaller number of prisoners began questioning whether their military training had accurately represented American character at all. The breakfast meal became a recurring symbol in post-war prisoner memoirs. Former captives described it not merely as food, but as evidence of systematic difference between Japanese and American military systems. Where Japanese logistics prioritized weapons and ammunition while accepting that soldiers might starve, American logistics treated food as fundamental to military effectiveness. This philosophical divergence manifests in something as simple as a breakfast. Trey suggested deeper contrasts in how the two nations conceptualized warfare and human value. By the end of their first week at Fort McCoy, Japanese prisoners had adapted to the meal schedule and portion sizes. The initial suspicion faded, replaced by pragmatic acceptance. Men ate what they were served, gaining weight for the first time in months. The psychological impact of adequate nutrition manifested in improved morale and increased willingness to participate in camp activities. Outcomes documented in American administrative reports that tracked prisoner behavior patterns. The feeding program at Fort McCoy represented American power expressed through abundance rather than coercion. For prisoners who had endured years of deprivation, this demonstration of logistical capacity conveyed a message more effective than any propaganda: that American military strength rested on industrial foundations capable of sustaining not only its own forces, but even its enemies. This realization would inform prisoner attitudes throughout the remainder of their captivity and, for many, shape their post-war understanding of why Japan had lost the war. The systematic processing of enemy prisoners represented a critical component of American military administration during World War II. The War Department's Prisoner of War Operations Division established comprehensive protocols governing every aspect of captive handling, from initial capture through eventual repatriation. Fort McCoy's implementation of these procedures reflected the broader American approach to POW management: bureaucratic thoroughness combined with pragmatic efficiency. Registration procedures began immediately following prisoner arrival. Each captive underwent individual documentation that recorded personal information, military background, and capture circumstances. American clerks, working with Japanese language interpreters contracted through the Military Intelligence Service, compiled detailed files on every prisoner. This information served multiple purposes: administrative tracking, intelligence gathering, and compliance with Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner identification. The registration process at Fort McCoy followed a standardized sequence. Prisoners provided their name, rank, military unit, and serial number, the minimum information required under international law. American interrogators requested but did not demand additional details about Japanese military operations, equipment, and strategy. Cooperation with interrogation remained voluntary, though records indicate that many prisoners provided information once they understood that refusal carried no punishment. The bureaucratic intensity of American record-keeping surprised many Japanese prisoners. Imperial Japanese Army administration maintained minimal paperwork for enlisted personnel, with many units relying on verbal orders and informal tracking systems. In contrast, American military culture produced documentation for virtually every activity. Each prisoner at Fort McCoy generated a file folder containing medical records, work assignments, disciplinary actions, mail correspondence, and eventual repatriation orders. Medical screening constituted a crucial element of prisoner processing. Army physicians examined each captive for wounds, diseases, malnutrition, and other conditions requiring treatment. The medical protocol addressed both immediate humanitarian concerns and practical public health considerations. Many prisoners captured in the Pacific carried tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, that required isolation and treatment to prevent transmission within the camp or to civilian populations. Fort McCoy's medical facilities included a dedicated POW hospital staffed by Army medical personnel. Declassified health reports indicate that approximately 30% of Japanese prisoners processed through the facility in late 1944 required medical intervention beyond routine examination. Common conditions included malnutrition-related ailments, untreated combat wounds, and infectious diseases contracted in jungle environments. The nutritional status of arriving prisoners provided stark evidence of Japanese military supply failures. Many captives exhibited signs of chronic caloric deficiency, weight loss, muscle atrophy, vitamin deficiencies, and weakened immune systems. American military physicians documented these conditions as evidence of the deteriorating Japanese logistical situation in the Pacific Theater. By late 1944, American submarine warfare had effectively severed Japanese supply lines, leaving isolated garrisons without adequate food, medicine, or ammunition. Dental examinations revealed particularly severe neglect. Japanese military dental care was minimal, and many prisoners presented with untreated cavities, abscesses, and periodontal disease. Army dentists provided necessary treatment, extracting damaged teeth and addressing infections. These procedures, routine in American military medicine, represented a level of healthcare most Japanese enlisted men had never experienced. The psychological condition of prisoners also received attention. Though 1940s military psychiatry lacked the sophistication of modern trauma medicine, medical officers noted that many prisoners displayed symptoms consistent with what would later be recognized as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, emotional numbing, and difficulty adapting to captivity. Some prisoners refused food despite obvious malnutrition, while others exhibited withdrawal and uncommunicativeness beyond what language barriers explained. American medical personnel approached prisoner healthcare with professional detachment. Their mission focused on restoring captives to functional health, both for humanitarian compliance and practical reasons. Healthy prisoners could perform labor assignments and posed fewer security risks. The quality of medical care provided to Japanese POWs exceeded what many had received as active soldiers in the Imperial Army, a fact that did not escape prisoner notice. Sanitation protocols at Fort McCoy reflected American military standards for hygiene and disease prevention. Prisoners received mandatory delousing treatment using insecticide powder, reducing the lice infestations common in combat environments. They were issued soap and required to shower regularly, practices enforced through routine inspections. These measures prevented disease outbreaks that had plagued military camps throughout history. The distribution of personal hygiene supplies carried both practical and symbolic significance. Each prisoner received a kit containing soap, a razor, a toothbrush, tooth powder, and a comb. These items, mundane to American soldiers, represented relative luxury to men who had lived for months without such amenities. The simple act of providing razors, potential weapons, demonstrated a calculated level of trust that many prisoners found disconcerting. Administrative tracking extended beyond individual prisoners to aggregate data analysis. Fort McCoy's command staff compiled regular reports on prisoner population demographics, health status, work productivity, and disciplinary incidents. These reports flowed upward through military channels to the office of the Provost Marshal General in Washington, creating a comprehensive data system that monitored POW operations nationwide. The interpreter corps played an essential role in processing operations. The War Department recruited Japanese Americans, many from families interned under Executive Order 9066, to serve as translators and interrogators. These linguists navigated complex cultural terrain, facilitating communication while mediating between two populations with deep mutual mistrust. Their work enabled the bureaucratic machinery of prisoner administration to function across linguistic and cultural divides. By the completion of initial processing, each Japanese prisoner at Fort McCoy possessed an American military identity, a file number, a medical record, a photograph, and a barracks assignment. This systematic documentation represented the American military's characteristic approach to large-scale organization, breaking complex problems into manageable procedures, collecting data, and maintaining accountability at every level. For the prisoners themselves, the processing experience reinforced emerging perceptions about American military culture. The thoroughness of documentation, the efficiency of medical care, and the systematic organization of every activity demonstrated an institutional capacity that differed fundamentally from Japanese military administration. These observations would inform prisoner assessments of why American forces were prevailing in the Pacific Theater, not merely through superior equipment, but through comprehensive systems that sustained combat effectiveness over prolonged campaigns. The utilization of prisoner-of-war labor represented a significant component of American home front economics during World War II. Under Geneva Convention provisions, detaining nations could employ prisoners in work assignments that did not directly support military operations. The United States implemented extensive POW labor programs, assigning captives to agricultural work, food processing, forestry, and other civilian industries experiencing severe labor shortages due to military mobilization. Fort McCoy's prisoner labor program focused primarily on agricultural work in surrounding Wisconsin counties. The state's farming economy faced critical labor deficits as young men departed for military service. Potato harvests, hay production, and dairy operations required manual labor that civilian populations could not adequately provide. The War Manpower Commission coordinated with the War Department to deploy POW labor under supervised conditions that satisfied both Geneva Convention requirements and civilian security concerns. Records from the Wisconsin State Historical Society document the implementation of this program during late 1944 and early 1945. Japanese prisoners from Fort McCoy were transported daily to contracted farms where they performed seasonal agricultural work. Guards accompanied each work detail, maintaining security while allowing prisoners sufficient freedom to complete assigned tasks. Farmers paid the U.S. government standard agricultural wages for prisoner labor, with a small portion credited to prisoner accounts for purchases at camp canteens. The work assignments followed strict guidelines. Prisoners could not be employed in munitions production, military construction, or any activity directly supporting combat operations. Agricultural work qualified as permissible under international law, particularly given the essential nature of food production to civilian populations. Administrative oversight ensured that prisoners worked reasonable hours under safe conditions and received the same workplace protections theoretically afforded to free agricultural workers. Japanese prisoners adapted to agricultural labor with varying degrees of proficiency. Many came from rural backgrounds in Japan and possessed farming skills transferable to Wisconsin agriculture. Others, primarily urban conscripts, learned agricultural tasks through practical experience. American farmers, initially suspicious of employing enemy captives, generally reported satisfaction with prisoner work ethic and productivity. Contemporary newspaper accounts from Wisconsin local papers describe farmers praising Japanese POWs as reliable, efficient workers who required minimal supervision once trained. The daily routine for prisoners assigned to agricultural details began with morning transport from Fort McCoy to contracted farms. Trucks carried work parties of 20 to 40 men accompanied by armed guards. Upon arrival, farmers provided task instructions through interpreters, assigning prisoners to specific activities: potato picking, hay stacking, vegetable harvesting, or general farm maintenance. Work continued through midday with a break for lunch, typically sandwiches and coffee, provided by the farmer or carried from the base mess. The physical labor represented a significant change from prisoner routines during the initial weeks of captivity. Agricultural work offered outdoor activity, purposeful employment, and interaction with American civilian populations' experiences that collectively expanded prisoner understanding of American society beyond the military context of Fort McCoy. Many former prisoners later described this period as psychologically beneficial, providing structure and purpose during uncertain captivity. Interactions between prisoners and Wisconsin farm families introduced complex social dynamics. American civilians held varied attitudes toward Japanese captives. Some farmers viewed prisoners pragmatically as labor resources solving genuine economic problems. Others harbored deep antipathy toward Japanese people generally, viewing all Japanese nationals as responsible for Pearl Harbor and Pacific War atrocities. Still others exhibited curiosity about enemy soldiers, observing them as individuals rather than propaganda caricatures. Security protocols governed civilian prisoner interaction. Guards maintained vigilance to prevent escape attempts and unauthorized communication. Farmers were instructed to minimize personal contact beyond work-related instructions. However, practical necessity and human nature inevitably produced informal exchanges. Shared gestures, rudimentary language attempts, and the universal language of agricultural work created limited but meaningful interaction across enemy lines. One documented incident illustrates the complexity of these encounters. A Wisconsin farmer's teenage daughter, curious about the Japanese workers in her family's potato field, approached the work detail to observe. A guard redirected her, maintaining the required separation between prisoners and civilians. The girl later told a local newspaper that the Japanese soldiers looked tired but polite, contradicting the monstrous image she had formed from wartime propaganda. This anecdote, repeated in various forms across Wisconsin communities, reflected gradual civilian recognition that enemy soldiers were human beings performing mundane labor rather than inhuman threats. The economic value of POW labor provided measurable benefits to Wisconsin agriculture. State agricultural reports from 1944-1945 indicate that prisoner work crews helped harvest over 300,000 bushels of potatoes and process substantial quantities of other crops. Without this labor contribution, significant agricultural production would have been lost, exacerbating food supply challenges on the home front. The program demonstrated how pragmatic policy could simultaneously comply with international law, support civilian economy, and maintain enemy combatants under secure conditions. Payment for prisoner labor followed complex regulations. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive compensation for work, though detaining nations could retain most wages to offset detention costs. At Fort McCoy, prisoners received small credits, typically 10 cents per day, deposited in personal accounts, usable for purchases at the camp canteen. This token payment provided prisoners limited economic agency, allowing them to buy cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper, and other small comforts. The canteen system itself reflected American consumer culture. Unlike Japanese military supply systems that provided only essential items through official channels, the Fort McCoy canteen operated as a small store where prisoners used earned credits to make purchasing decisions. This exposure to market economics, even in minimal form, introduced many prisoners to American commercial practices. Some former prisoners later credited this experience with influencing their post-war careers in business and commerce. Agricultural work also produced unintended educational outcomes. Prisoners observed American farming techniques, equipment, and organizational methods that differed significantly from Japanese agricultural practices. Wisconsin dairy operations, mechanized harvesting equipment, and large-scale crop production demonstrated agricultural industrialization that impressed many prisoners. These observations contributed to broader prisoner recognition of American industrial capacity, a factor directly relevant to understanding Japanese defeat in the war. By spring 1945, the agricultural labor program had become routine at Fort McCoy. Prisoners rotated through work assignments, guards maintained professional oversight, and Wisconsin farmers integrated POW labor into their operational planning. The system functioned efficiently, serving economic needs while maintaining security and international law compliance. For the prisoners themselves, agricultural work provided purpose, outdoor activity, and glimpses of American civilian life that complicated their understanding of the enemy nation holding them captive. The extended interaction between Japanese prisoners and American guards at Fort McCoy created conditions for limited but significant cultural exchange. Despite linguistic barriers, ideological differences, and the fundamental adversarial relationship of captivity, daily proximity over months produced human connections that transcended wartime propaganda on both sides. American guards assigned to Fort McCoy represented diverse regional backgrounds, ages, and attitudes toward their Japanese captives. Many were older soldiers deemed unsuitable for combat deployment, reservists, or personnel recovering from injuries sustained in earlier fighting. Some carried personal grievances, brothers or friends killed in the Pacific Theater, that colored their perception of Japanese prisoners. Others approached guard duty as routine military work, maintaining professional distance without particular animosity. The guard force received explicit instructions regarding prisoner treatment. Military regulations required firm discipline, but prohibited abuse, unnecessary force, or actions violating Geneva Convention standards. Guards were to maintain security, enforce camp rules, and report violations through proper channels. Regular inspections by inspector general teams verified compliance, with disciplinary consequences for guards who mistreated prisoners. Initial interactions between guards and prisoners remained formal and cautious. Guards issued commands through interpreters, maintaining authority through military bearing rather than aggression. Prisoners responded with the deference characteristic of Japanese military culture, bowing when receiving instructions and avoiding direct eye contact with authority figures. This mutual formality created a structured but emotionally distant relationship. Over time, routine familiarity eroded some barriers. Guards learned to recognize individual prisoners, noting who performed work assignments diligently, who required reminders, and who demonstrated leadership among fellow captives. Prisoners similarly distinguished between guards, which ones enforced rules strictly, which ones exhibited flexibility, and which ones displayed personal kindness beyond duty requirements. Small gestures facilitated limited connection. A guard might offer a cigarette to a prisoner during a work break. A prisoner might assist a guard with a broken piece of equipment. These minor exchanges, while not friendship, represented acknowledgement of shared humanity. Former prisoners later described certain guards as fair or kind, terms that in their context meant treating captives with professional courtesy rather than contempt. Language learning became an unofficial form of cultural exchange. Some prisoners attempted to learn English phrases from guards, while a few guards picked up basic Japanese words. This linguistic interaction remained rudimentary, mostly practical vocabulary, related to work and camp routine, but the effort itself signaled willingness to bridge the communication gap. One former prisoner recalled a guard who practiced Japanese numbers, laughing at his own mispronunciation while prisoners patiently corrected him. The guards themselves varied in their perceptions of Japanese captives. Some maintained rigid distinctions. These were enemies, not colleagues, and fraternization was inappropriate. Others developed more nuanced views, recognizing prisoners as soldiers who had followed orders just as American troops did. A few guards privately questioned the propaganda narrative that portrayed Japanese soldiers as inherently barbaric, finding their actual captives to be disciplined, respectful, and remarkably ordinary. One documented exchange exemplifies this evolution. An American guard named Dawson from Texas had lost his brother in combat in the Philippines. He initially volunteered for POW guard duty, hoping to confront Japanese soldiers personally. During a work detail, a prisoner named Tanaka, through an interpreter, mentioned that his younger brother had died at Guadalcanal. The conversation that followed, brief and translated haltingly, touched on shared loss and the arbitrary cruelty of war. Neither man softened his commitment to his nation's cause, but both recognized grief as a universal human experience transcending enemy lines. American guards also observed prisoner behavior patterns that challenged stereotypes. Japanese prisoners maintained rigorous personal discipline, keeping barracks immaculately clean and following camp routines with precision. They showed deep respect for rank hierarchies, with senior officers maintaining authority over younger enlisted men, despite captivity's leveling effect. They demonstrated surprising adaptability, learning new tasks quickly and performing agricultural labor with diligence. These observations troubled some guards who had internalized propaganda about Japanese fanaticism and cruelty. The prisoners at Fort McCoy did not match the monstrous caricatures of wartime media. They were tired men, far from home, caught in circumstances beyond their control. This realization did not erase legitimate anger over Japanese military atrocities, the Bataan Death March, mistreatment of Allied POWs, and civilian massacres remained historical facts. However, it complicated simple moral narratives, forcing recognition that ordinary soldiers often bore little responsibility for high command decisions. The guards' own experiences shaped their perspectives. Many had witnessed combat's chaos and understood how circumstances could transform decent men into participants in violence. They knew that American forces had also committed acts during the war that violated ideal conduct. This awareness created space for moral complexity, condemning Japanese military aggression while recognizing individual prisoners as human beings shaped by their nation's culture and coerced into service. Cultural differences sometimes produced misunderstanding or conflict. Japanese prisoners' deference could be misinterpreted as deception by guards unfamiliar with Asian cultural norms around authority and respect. Guards' casual informality, common in American military culture, struck prisoners as unprofessional or disrespectful. These cultural gaps required ongoing navigation by both parties and interpreters who mediated not just language but cultural context. Entertainment provided occasional opportunities for cross-cultural observation. The American military showed films in camp recreation facilities, and prisoners attended screenings of newsreels and Hollywood movies. These films exposed prisoners to American civilian life, popular culture, and wartime propaganda. Watching prisoners' reactions, guards noted their intense focus and occasional confusion at images so foreign to Japanese experience. Music also crossed cultural boundaries. American guards listened to jazz, swing, and popular music on radios near guard posts. Some prisoners, hearing these unfamiliar sounds, displayed curiosity or even appreciation. One guard recalled a prisoner who stood near the fence during breaks, listening to radio broadcasts of swing bands with an expression of concentrated attention. When the guard asked through an interpreter if he enjoyed the music, the prisoner responded that he had never heard anything like it, neither approving nor disapproving, simply acknowledging difference. As months passed, a subtle shift occurred in camp atmosphere. The acute tension of early captivity eased into routine coexistence. Guards and prisoners developed working relationships based on mutual predictability rather than trust or affection. This functional détente allowed both groups to navigate their circumstances with reduced stress, though the fundamental power imbalance of captivity remained constant. The cultural exchange at Fort McCoy remained limited and asymmetrical. Guards returned to barracks where they enjoyed relative freedom, correspondence with families, and normal American life. Prisoners remained confined, separated from loved ones, and uncertain of their fate. However, within these constraints, small moments of human recognition occurred, moments that would influence how both groups remembered the war and their role in it long after peace arrived. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation via radio broadcast, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration terms and unconditional surrender to Allied forces. This unprecedented event, the first time most Japanese citizens heard their emperor's voice, marked the formal end of World War II in the Pacific Theater. The news reached American military installations within hours through official channels, but its transmission to Japanese prisoners of war required careful management. At Fort McCoy, camp administrators received notification of Japan's surrender on August 15th via teletype communication from the Office of the Provost Marshal General. The installation's commanding officer immediately convened senior staff to plan how to inform Japanese prisoners. The situation presented delicate challenges. Prisoners might react with disbelief, emotional distress, or potentially violent resistance if they interpreted surrender as dishonor or false propaganda. Military intelligence officers assigned to Fort McCoy had anticipated this moment throughout spring and summer 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th had generated intense discussion among prisoners, though American authorities initially limited information about these events. When news of the bombings filtered through camp, prisoners reacted with confusion and skepticism. The scale of destruction described seemed impossible to many who questioned whether such weapons could exist. On August 16th, Fort McCoy's command staff arranged a formal assembly of all Japanese prisoners. Guards escorted prisoners from barracks to the camp's central parade ground, where they stood in military formation facing a raised platform. Through interpreters, the camp commander read an official statement. The Japanese government had surrendered. The war was over, and prisoners would eventually be repatriated according to procedures established by Allied authorities. The prisoners' immediate reaction was silence. Contemporary reports from American observers noted that the assembly remained motionless for several seconds following the announcement. Then, gradually, prisoners began talking among themselves in low voices. Some appeared stunned, others exhibited visible distress, and a few showed what American observers interpreted as relief. No violent incidents occurred, though guards maintained heightened alertness. In the hours following the announcement, prisoners processed the information through different interpretive frameworks. Senior Japanese officers maintained formal dignity, offering no public comment on the emperor's decision, but reinforcing discipline among lower-ranking prisoners. Enlisted men exhibited varied responses. Some wept quietly, others sat in contemplative silence, and a few expressed anger at what they perceived as betrayal by Japan's leadership. The cultural significance of emperor-ordered surrender cannot be overstated. Japanese military indoctrination had cultivated near-religious devotion to the emperor as a divine figure whose authority was absolute. When Hirohito himself commanded cessation of hostilities, even the most militant prisoners faced psychological imperative to accept this reality. However, acceptance did not mean comprehension. Many prisoners struggled to reconcile surrender with everything they had been taught about honor, duty, and Japanese superiority. American authorities understood that prisoner morale might deteriorate following surrender news. Defeated soldiers in captivity faced uncertain futures and potential stigmatization if repatriated. To manage these concerns, Fort McCoy administrators emphasized that prisoners would be treated no differently post-surrender than before. Geneva Convention protections remained in effect. Repatriation would proceed through orderly processes, and no punitive measures would result from Japan's defeat. In subsequent days, camp authorities provided additional information about the war's conclusion. Prisoners received access to newspapers featuring photographs of surrender ceremonies, occupation forces entering Japan, and the extensive destruction of Japanese cities through conventional and atomic bombing. These images shocked many prisoners who had been isolated from accurate information about Japan's deteriorating military position. The photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki generated particular distress. The scale of devastation visible in aerial images exceeded anything in prisoners' experience. Some questioned whether the photographs were genuine, suspecting American propaganda designed to justify surrender. Others recognized the image's authenticity and struggled to comprehend weapons capable of such destruction. A few prisoners had family in or near the affected cities, and their anguish was profound. Prisoner correspondence increased dramatically following surrender. Camp authorities relaxed previous restrictions on mail frequency, allowing prisoners to write letters home seeking information about family welfare. However, the destroyed state of Japanese postal infrastructure meant many letters went unanswered for months. This communication void intensified prisoners' anxiety about loved ones' fate. The psychological impact of defeat manifested differently among individuals. Younger prisoners, particularly those conscripted near war's end with limited combat experience, generally adapted more readily to peace. Older career soldiers and officers struggled more visibly, facing not just defeat but the collapse of a world order they had served their entire adult lives. Some withdrew into silence, while others found solace in maintaining military routines and discipline even in captivity. American guards observed these reactions with mixed emotions. Some felt vindication, their nation had prevailed, the enemy was defeated. Others experienced more complex feelings, recognizing that victory meant little to individual soldiers on either side, who had suffered and lost regardless of outcome. The guards continued their duties professionally, understanding that prisoner welfare remained their responsibility until repatriation occurred. Fort McCoy's command implemented programs to maintain prisoner morale during the uncertain post-surrender period. Work assignments continued, providing structure and purpose. Camp authorities arranged recreational activities and allowed prisoners greater autonomy in organizing their communal life. These measures sought to prevent the despair and hopelessness that could arise among defeated soldiers with uncertain futures. Discussion among prisoners turned increasingly toward repatriation prospects and post-war Japan. What would they find upon return? Would their families have survived? Would they face social stigma as defeated soldiers? Would American occupation authorities treat returned prisoners harshly? These questions circulated through barracks conversations, with few confident answers available. Some prisoners expressed fear about repatriation itself. Reports from the Pacific Theater indicated that Japanese civilians and military personnel had committed suicide rather than accept American occupation. While prisoners at Fort McCoy had experienced humane treatment, they could not know whether American forces in Japan would behave similarly. Additionally, they feared judgment from fellow Japanese who had not surrendered, who might view them as cowards or traitors. A smaller number of prisoners expressed different concerns entirely. Their months at Fort McCoy had exposed them to American society, values, and material abundance that contradicted everything their training had taught. They had observed American industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and a military culture that balanced discipline with human dignity. These observations raised uncomfortable questions about Japanese militarism, authoritarian government, and the propaganda that had shaped their worldview. In the weeks following surrender, Fort McCoy maintained operational routine while preparing for eventual prisoner repatriation. Administrative staff compiled documentation on each prisoner, medical records, work assignments, disciplinary history, and personal information needed for processing upon return to Japan. This bureaucratic work proceeded methodically, though actual repatriation timelines remained unclear given the logistical challenges of transporting thousands of prisoners across the Pacific. The war's end brought no immediate change to daily life at Fort McCoy. Prisoners continued agricultural work, ate the same meals, and lived under the same conditions. However, the psychological landscape had shifted fundamentally. They were no longer active combatants whose fate remained tied to ongoing military operations. They were defeated soldiers awaiting return to a homeland transformed by occupation and nuclear warfare, a future they could barely imagine from the Wisconsin countryside where they had spent months contemplating the meaning of captivity, humanity, and war. The repatriation of Japanese prisoners of war from American custody began in late 1945, following Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The process involved coordinating the return of thousands of prisoners scattered across American detention facilities in the continental United States, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands. Fort McCoy's Japanese prisoners entered this repatriation pipeline through systematic procedures designed to ensure orderly, documented return to Japanese authorities. The logistics of prisoner repatriation fell under the authority of the War Department's Repatriation Branch, established specifically to manage the massive undertaking of returning enemy combatants to defeated Axis nations. For Japanese prisoners, repatriation posed unique challenges. Japan's maritime infrastructure had been devastated by years of submarine warfare and strategic bombing. Port facilities required reconstruction, and available shipping capacity was prioritized for occupation forces, humanitarian supplies, and repatriating Allied POWs before addressing Japanese prisoner return. Fort McCoy received initial repatriation orders in October 1945. These directives specified that Japanese prisoners would be transported in groups to West Coast ports, primarily Seattle and San Francisco, where they would board ships bound for Japan. The timing of individual prisoner departures depended on multiple factors: shipping availability, prisoner health status, and administrative priorities established by occupation authorities in Japan. Preparation for repatriation involved comprehensive final processing. Each prisoner underwent medical examination to certify fitness for trans-Pacific voyage. Prisoners with serious health conditions requiring ongoing treatment remained at Fort McCoy until sufficiently recovered. American medical personnel compiled medical records summarizing each prisoner's health history during captivity, documentation that would transfer to Japanese authorities upon repatriation. Administrative processing included final documentation review, verification of prisoner identity, and compilation of personal files containing all records generated during captivity. The U.S. military maintained meticulous paperwork tracking each prisoner's movement, work assignments, disciplinary actions, and correspondence. This documentation served multiple purposes, ensuring no prisoner was inadvertently retained, providing records for potential war crimes investigations, and defending against future accusations of prisoner mistreatment. Prisoners received instructions about repatriation procedures through interpreters at camp assemblies. They were informed that repatriation would occur in stages, that specific departure dates remained subject to change, and that they should prepare personal belongings for transport. Each prisoner was permitted to retain personal items acquired during captivity, including photographs, letters, and small purchased goods from the camp canteen. The emotional atmosphere at Fort McCoy during repatriation preparations was complex. Many prisoners expressed eagerness to return home after months of separation from families. Others exhibited anxiety about what they would find in occupied Japan. Some voiced fears about social stigma associated with surrender and captivity. American staff observed that prisoners displayed a mixture of anticipation and apprehension as departure dates approached. Fort McCoy's first repatriation group departed in November 1945. Approximately 100 prisoners boarded trains for transport to the West Coast. The departure process followed formal military ceremony. Prisoners formed ranks, senior Japanese officers saluted American camp officers, and guards escorted the group to waiting transport. Contemporary accounts describe a subdued, orderly departure with little visible emotion on either side. The train journey across the United States exposed prisoners to American geography and civilian life. Looking through train car windows, Japanese prisoners observed cities, farmland, industrial centers, and the vast continental interior. This transit provided final impressions of American scale and prosperity observations many former prisoners later cited as influential in their post-war understanding of why Japan had lost the war. Upon arrival at Pacific ports, prisoners entered processing centers where final administrative checks occurred before embarkation. Military police maintained security while ensuring prisoners received adequate food, shelter, and medical attention during what could be several days' wait for assigned vessels. The U.S. Navy and contracted merchant vessels provided transport across the Pacific, with voyages typically lasting 2 to 3 weeks depending on weather and routing. Shipboard conditions varied considerably. Some vessels offered relatively comfortable accommodations with adequate space and provisions. Others, pressed into service to meet repatriation demands, provided more austere conditions with crowded berths and basic rations. However, even basic conditions exceeded what many prisoners had experienced during their combat service in the Pacific Islands, where supply shortages had been chronic. The Pacific crossing gave prisoners extended time for reflection. Isolated on ships traveling toward uncertain futures, they discussed what awaited them in occupied Japan. Some speculated about American occupation policies, others worried about finding employment in Japan's destroyed economy, and many contemplated how to explain their captivity experience to families and communities. Arrival in Japan confronted prisoners with the war's devastating physical impact. Major ports like Yokohama and Kobe bore visible scars of American bombing campaigns. Urban landscapes showed entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The infrastructure damage exceeded what prisoners had imagined based on camp rumors and limited wartime information. For many, the sight of destroyed Japanese cities provided the first visceral understanding of total war's consequences. Processing upon arrival in Japan occurred at designated repatriation centers operated by occupation authorities. American military police transferred custody of returning prisoners to Japanese civilian authorities who had been organized by Occupation Command to manage demobilization. This transfer involved final documentation, brief interrogation to verify no war crimes allegations existed against individual returnees, and issuance of papers authorizing travel within occupied Japan. Former prisoners then began the complicated journey to home communities, complicated because Japan's S-rail system had been heavily damaged and travel restrictions under occupation required documentation and approval. Many walked portions of their journey, traveling through landscapes transformed by war. Rural areas showed less physical destruction, but suffered from agricultural disruption and food shortages that would plague Japan for years. Reception of returning prisoners by Japanese civilians varied. Some communities welcomed soldiers home regardless of circumstances. Others treated returned POWs with suspicion or contempt, viewing surrender as shameful failure that dishonored families and community. Social stigma associated with capture persisted in Japanese culture long after war's end, creating isolation for many former prisoners despite their having survived circumstances beyond their control. The contrast between treatment as prisoners in America and treatment as returned veterans in Japan was stark. At Fort McCoy, prisoners had received adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment consistent with Geneva Convention standards. Upon repatriation, they entered an occupied nation facing food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and a traumatized population. For some former prisoners, this contrast reinforced perceptions formed during captivity about American material abundance and organizational capability. Repatriation from Fort McCoy continued through early 1946 as shipping schedules permitted. The final groups of Japanese prisoners departed Wisconsin that spring, concluding nearly 2 years of POW operations at the installation. By summer 1946, Fort McCoy's prisoner compound stood empty, gradually repurposed for other military uses as the Army transitioned to peacetime configuration. For the several hundred Japanese soldiers who passed through Fort McCoy during World War II, repatriation marked the end of captivity, but not the end of their war experience's influence. The months spent in Wisconsin had exposed them to aspects of American society, values, and military culture that challenged assumptions formed during years of militaristic indoctrination. Whether these exposures produced lasting attitude changes varied individually, but collectively they represented a form of unintended cultural exchange with implications extending into post-war Reconstruction and Japanese-American relations. The return of Japanese prisoners of war to their homeland occurred during one of the most transformative periods in modern Japanese history. The American occupation of Japan, which began immediately following surrender and continued until 1952, fundamentally restructured Japanese society, politics, and economy. Former POWs re-entered this transformed nation, carrying experiences that set them apart from fellow Japanese who had remained in the home islands throughout the war. Occupied Japan presented returning soldiers with a society in crisis. Urban destruction from strategic bombing had left major cities largely demolished. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other industrial centers, consisted of vast expanses of rubble and hastily constructed shelters. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had produced destruction of unprecedented scale, with both cities requiring decades of reconstruction. Infrastructure damage extended beyond buildings to include railroads, bridges, port facilities, and utilities, all degraded by years of warfare. Economic conditions were catastrophic. Japan's industrial capacity had been systematically destroyed by American bombing campaigns targeting war production. Agricultural output had collapsed due to labor shortages, disrupted distribution systems, and fertilizer shortages. Food scarcity produced widespread malnutrition, with official rations in urban areas falling to levels below minimal caloric requirements. Black markets flourished as desperate populations sought to supplement inadequate official provisions. Into this environment, former prisoners returned carrying memories of relative abundance experienced during American captivity. Men who had eaten 3 substantial meals daily at Fort McCoy now observed Japanese families subsisting on rice gruel and wild vegetation. This contrast generated complex emotional responses: guilt at having been well fed while compatriots starved, anger at Japanese military leadership whose policies had led to such devastation, and continued processing of what American treatment had revealed about comparative national capacities. The social reception of returned POWs varied considerably across Japanese society. Traditional cultural values emphasized honor through combat death or victory, making survival through surrender deeply shameful. Some families welcomed soldiers home simply grateful for survival. Others treated returnees with coldness or outright rejection, viewing them as cowards who had failed their duty. This stigmatization particularly affected younger soldiers who had surrendered in the Pacific Islands, where resistance until death had been expected. Former POWs faced additional challenges in navigating occupied Japan's political landscape. American occupation authorities implemented demilitarization policies that included purging militarists from public life, dismantling the military establishment, and promoting democratic reforms. Veterans generally, and former POWs specifically, occupied ambiguous status within this new order. They were products of the discredited militarist system, but also victims of that system's failures. Employment prospects for returned soldiers were poor. Japan's destroyed economy offered few opportunities, particularly for men whose primary experience had been military service in a now abolished army. Some former POWs found work in reconstruction efforts, applying physical labor to rebuilding cities. Others became farmers, returning to rural origins or starting new agricultural ventures. A few leveraged language skills or cultural knowledge acquired during captivity to work with occupation authorities as interpreters or liaisons. A minority of former Fort McCoy prisoners became advocates for democratic reform and Japanese-American reconciliation. These individuals, influenced by their POW experiences, argued publicly that American treatment had demonstrated alternatives to Japanese authoritarianism. One notable example was a former teacher who resumed educational work and incorporated lessons about American democracy into his teaching. His published essays described Fort McCoy as an introduction to principles of human rights and rule of law that Japan should adopt. However, most returning POWs remained silent about their captivity experiences. Social stigma made discussing surrender and imprisonment dangerous to reputation and family honor. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese devastation raised uncomfortable questions about wartime propaganda and militarist ideology. Many former prisoners chose private accommodation with their experiences rather than public testimony that might invite controversy or persecution. The occupation's duration, 7 years, provided time for gradual social adjustment. As immediate post-war crises eased and economic recovery began, attitudes toward former POWs slowly evolved. The stigma of surrender diminished as Japanese society collectively confronted the catastrophic costs of militarism and war. By the early 1950s, returned soldiers, including former POWs, had largely been reintegrated into civilian life, though individual experiences varied widely based on community attitudes and personal circumstances. Some former prisoners maintained correspondence with Americans they had encountered during captivity. Letters exchanged between former guards and former prisoners during the late 1940s and 1950s reveal complex ongoing processing of wartime experiences. These correspondents often expressed mutual respect and occasionally discussed visiting each other's countries' exchanges, unthinkable during wartime, but possible in the post-war period as former enemies began transforming into Cold War allies. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, created new dynamics in Japanese-American relations. Japan became a critical support base for United Nations forces fighting in Korea, with American military presence expanding significantly on Japanese territory. Some former POWs found employment working for American forces as civilian contractors, creating situations where former prisoners of Americans now worked alongside them against a new communist threat. This geopolitical shift accelerated Japanese-American reconciliation and provided economic opportunities for veterans who could navigate bicultural environments. Academic study of POW experiences began emerging in the 1950s as scholars examined World War II as social dimensions. Japanese researchers interviewed former prisoners, though social taboos around surrender meant many declined participation. American academics also studied the POW experience from their perspective, analyzing how enemy prisoner treatment had served both humanitarian and strategic purposes. These early studies laid groundwork for more comprehensive historical examination that would develop in subsequent decades. Memorial activities related to World War II evolved gradually in post-war Japan. Initially, commemoration focused on Japanese suffering, atomic bombing victims, civilian casualties, and national defeats trauma. Over time, more nuanced approaches emerged that acknowledged Japanese military aggression while honoring individual soldiers' sacrifices. Former POWs occupied uncomfortable positions in these narratives, neither celebrated as heroes nor entirely forgotten, but existing in ambiguous memorial space. By the 1960s and 1970s, former Fort McCoy prisoners had fully reintegrated into Japanese society. They had established careers, raised families, and participated in Japan's remarkable economic recovery that transformed the nation into a global industrial power. Their POW experiences had become private memories rather than defining public identities. However, for those who had lived through months at Fort McCoy, those memories retained significance as formative experiences that had challenged assumptions, revealed unexpected human decency, and demonstrated that even enemies could recognize shared humanity. The long-term impact of POW experiences on individual former prisoners is difficult to assess comprehensively. Some clearly maintained pro-American attitudes throughout their lives, supporting the post-war alliance and advocating for continued cooperation. Others remained ambivalent, appreciating fair treatment during captivity while resenting Japan's defeat and occupation. A few rejected American influence entirely, viewing their POW treatment as psychological manipulation designed to undermine Japanese resistance and facilitate occupation. What is clear from available historical evidence is that POW experiences at facilities like Fort McCoy represented more than simple detention. They constituted encounters with alternative social systems, values, and organizational principles that challenged captives' understanding of their world. For Japanese prisoners who had been taught that Americans were barbarous enemies, the reality of Geneva Convention compliance, adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment posed cognitive challenges requiring psychological adjustment. These adjustments varied individually, but collectively they contributed to post-war Japanese reassessment of wartime ideology and gradual embrace of democratic values, aligned with American influence. The treatment of prisoners of war during World War Two occurred within a framework established by the Geneva Convention of 1929, formally titled the Convention Relative to the Treatment of Prisoners of War. This international agreement, negotiated in the aftermath of World War I's horrors, sought to establish minimum humanitarian standards for enemy combatants in captivity. The Convention's provisions addressed food, shelter, medical care, labor, discipline, and repatriation, creating legal obligations for signatory nations. The United States ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention in 1932, thereby accepting international legal obligations regarding POW treatment. American compliance with these obligations during World War II reflected multiple motivations: genuine humanitarian concern, desire to encourage enemy surrenders through promise of decent treatment, hope for reciprocal treatment of American prisoners, and commitment to demonstrating American values to international audiences. The Convention's fundamental principle held that prisoners of war remained protected persons whose rights detaining powers must respect. Article 2 specified that prisoners shall at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. Subsequent articles elaborated detailed requirements covering virtually every aspect of captivity, from housing standards to religious accommodations. Food provisions occupied particular attention in the Convention. Article 11 mandated that daily rations shall be equal in quantity and quality to those of depot troops of the detaining power. This requirement prevented detaining nations from deliberately starving prisoners while maintaining their own forces adequately. The United States interpreted this provision strictly, providing POWs food equivalent to that served to American soldiers at stateside bases, a policy that produced the abundance Japanese prisoners encountered at Fort McCoy. The Convention also addressed prisoner labor, permitting detaining powers to employ prisoners in work that did not directly support military operations. Article 32 specified that the labor of prisoners of war shall have no direct relation with war operations. This provision allowed agricultural work, forestry, and civilian construction, while prohibiting munitions production or military fortification. American POW labor programs, including Fort McCoy's agricultural assignments, carefully adhered to these restrictions. Medical care provisions required that prisoners receive treatment equivalent to that provided to detaining powers forces. Article 15 mandated that belligerents shall take all necessary sanitary measures to ensure the cleanliness and salubrity of camps and shall provide adequate medical facilities. American military medicine standards, therefore, extended to enemy prisoners, ensuring they received professional health care consistent with contemporary medical practice. Disciplinary provisions established that prisoners remain subject to detaining powers military law but retain protections against abuse. Article 54 prohibited corporal punishment, close confinement in premises without daylight, and any form of torture or cruelty. Prisoners could be disciplined for violations of camp rules, but punishments had to be proportionate and documented. American military records from Fort McCoy show few disciplinary incidents among Japanese prisoners, suggesting generally compliant behavior and fair enforcement. Not all combatant nations adhered to Geneva Convention standards during World War II. Japanese military authorities, while technically bound by the Convention, systematically violated it in treatment of Allied prisoners. The Bataan Death March, Thailand-Burma railway construction, and numerous camp atrocities documented extensively in post-war war crimes trials demonstrated deliberate disregard for prisoner welfare. These violations created moral asymmetry. Americans treated Japanese prisoners according to international law, while American prisoners in Japanese custody suffered severe abuse. This asymmetry raised complex questions about reciprocity and fairness. Some American voices argued that Japanese violations justified reciprocal mistreatment of Japanese prisoners. However, American military and political leadership rejected this argument, maintaining that Geneva Convention compliance served American interests regardless of enemy behavior. This position reflected both principled commitment to humanitarian law and pragmatic calculation that maintaining standards would better serve long-term strategic goals. The treatment of Japanese POWs at Fort McCoy and similar American facilities demonstrated how international humanitarian law functioned when a powerful nation chose to comply. The system worked not because enforcement mechanisms compelled compliance. International law lacked coercive power over major nations, but because American leadership determined that compliance advanced national interests. This reality illustrated both international humanitarian law's potential and its limitations. It established standards that could guide behavior, but could not guarantee compliance by unwilling parties. Comparative analysis of POW treatment across World War II reveals stark variations. German prisoners in American and British custody generally received treatment consistent with Geneva Convention standards. American and British prisoners in German custody experienced conditions that varied from adequate to harsh, but rarely approached the systematic cruelty Japanese forces inflicted. Soviet treatment of German prisoners was brutal, with hundreds of thousands dying in Soviet camps from starvation, disease, and abuse. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was equally catastrophic, with millions dying through deliberate neglect. The Japanese-American POW experience represented one pole of this spectrum. Systematic American compliance with international law contrasted with systematic Japanese violations. This contrast influenced post-war development of international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, negotiated after World War II, strengthened and expanded POW protections while adding provisions for civilian populations. The 1929 Convention's failures to prevent widespread abuses informed these revisions, though perfect enforcement remained elusive. Historians studying World War II POW experiences emphasize that individual prisoner treatment depended heavily on which nation held custody. An American captured by Japanese forces faced odds of survival around 50 to 60%, with survivors typically experiencing severe malnutrition, disease, and abuse. A Japanese soldier captured by American forces faced extremely high survival odds, over 95%, with adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment. This dramatic difference reflected not just different national characters, but different military cultures, logistical capabilities, and interpretations of international legal obligations. The Fort McCoy experience, specifically, illustrated how international humanitarian law could function when supported by adequate resources and institutional commitment. The United States possessed logistical capacity to feed, house, and guard prisoners adequately. American military culture emphasized bureaucratic procedures and accountability, ensuring compliance with regulations. American political culture valued adherence to legal commitments, even when dealing with enemies. These factors combined to produce prisoner treatment that met and often exceeded minimum Geneva Convention requirements. Long-term implications of American POW policy extended beyond individual prisoner experiences. By demonstrating that even enemies could be treated humanely, American authorities reinforced claims about American values and democratic governance. This soft power aspect of prisoner treatment contributed to post-war occupation success in both Germany and Japan, where defeated populations had witnessed or experienced American adherence to legal and moral standards even during wartime. The Geneva Convention framework itself demonstrated international community's recognition that warfare, however destructive, remained subject to legal and moral limits. The convention represented collective human judgment that certain practices, torture, starvation, deliberate degradation of captives violated fundamental standards, regardless of military utility. American compliance with this framework during World War II affirmed these principles at a historical moment when total war might otherwise have erased all restraint. For the Japanese prisoners who experienced American captivity at Fort McCoy and similar facilities, Geneva Convention compliance manifested as concrete reality. Meals served regularly, medical care provided, dignity maintained. These experiences challenged propaganda narratives about American barbarism and created psychological conditions for post-war reconciliation. Whether or not individual prisoners consciously understood their treatment as implementation of international humanitarian law, they experienced its practical effects and drew conclusions about American character based on observed behavior. The broader lesson from Fort McCoy's history concerns the relationship between law, power, and morality in warfare. International humanitarian law establishes standards, but compliance ultimately depends on domestic will and capability. Strong nations can choose compliance or violation based on their interests and values. American treatment of Japanese POWs demonstrated that even in total war against a brutal enemy, maintaining humanitarian standards remained possible and arguably beneficial. This historical example continues informing contemporary debates about prisoner treatment, suggesting that adherence to legal and moral limits strengthens rather than weakens military effectiveness and strategic success.